From high atop the battlements of Castle Curmudgeon, where defeating Canada isn't just a fun leisure activity, it's a way of life. Good evening, Mr. and Mrs. America, and all Zambonis at sea. Welcome to the Blast Radius. Delighted to have you with us tonight. And yes, full disclosure, I didn't watch any of the Olympics this year. In fact, I haven't watched the Olympics in a good number of years, since the Olympics, like nearly all sporting competitions, have been utterly ruined by the imposition of dumb political activist bullshit. But, having said that, when the gold medal game in hockey is the USA versus Canada, I will make a one-time exception for that. And I'm glad I did, because today, on the 46th anniversary of the Lake Placid Miracle on Ice, the Americans defeated Kazakhstan 2-1 in overtime for our third ever gold medal in hockey. I guess we have to say men's hockey now, but whatever. Why do they have to play 3-on-3 overtime in the gold medal game? I can't say, but it sucks. And it's stupid. How did it happen that the host nation built a hockey rink that doesn't resemble the dimensions of a regulation hockey rink anywhere in the world, and without anybody noticing until it was far too late? Again, I can't say, but it sucks. And it's stupid. But setting those complaints aside, it's a pretty fantastic game. And though I no longer give two squirts of piss about the Olympics, I am glad we won. Now, in the United States, for the average American, this is going to be a thing that provides maybe a couple days of enjoyment and good feelings and is then quickly forgotten about. But in Canada, this is going to be recorded as one of the blackest days in their history. Not their sporting history, mind you, but their national history. Does that make this victory even more gratifying? Yes. Yes, it does. But we're not here to talk about hockey tonight. We're actually here to talk about something much sexier and more exciting: tariffs. Now, as you have most assuredly already heard by now, 2 days ago, the Supreme Court handed down a 6-3 decision in which the majority held that President Donald Trump exceeded his authority under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act of 1977, a law that was passed by Democrat majorities in both houses of Congress and then signed into law by a Democrat president, in which Congress invested the chief executive with the authority to, at his own discretion, identify and declare economic emergencies related to international commerce, and to take whatever remedial measures he deems appropriate, including the imposition of tariffs and other associated duties. But since Trump is the president now, the Washington establishment doesn't necessarily believe the things it believed 49 years ago. And if there's anything we know about the Washington establishment, it is that Chief Justice John Roberts is one of its very favorite sons. And if there's anything we know about John Roberts, it's that he hates Donald Trump with the white-hot, burning intensity of 1,000 suns. Roberts has been looking for an opportunity to get into a dick-measuring contest with Trump and thus assert the continuing supremacy of the Washington establishment by kneecapping some major aspect of his second-term agenda, and I guess he thinks that he has found it here. The legal rationale isn't much to write home about, really. The majority opinion, authored by Roberts himself, makes the rather fanciful argument that Trump needed to go back to Congress and ask them to confirm on a case-by-case basis the authority that the 1977 Congress already exclusively invested in the president. Will this decision make a whole lot of difference as a practical matter? Not really. Because, as Justice Brett Kavanaugh correctly noted in his dissenting opinion, there are 3 or 4 other statutory avenues whereby Trump can continue levying the exact same tariffs he has already been levying, and if the Supreme Court wants to neuter all of those, that will take many years to accomplish. And let's go ahead and ask the question that functions as the rhetorical elephant in the room. If Congress doesn't like the way the president is executing one of its statutes, shouldn't they handle it by repealing or rewriting or revising the piece of legislation in question? In a sane world, yes. But alas, we don't live in a sane world, and so here we are. As we know all too well, since this is a thing that involves Donald Trump, the current conversation around tariffs tends to take the form of a zero-sum game. If you're a fan of Trump, then tariffs are great and awesome and wonderful, but if you're a member of Team Orange Man Bad, if your idea of sartorial tastefulness is wearing a pussy hat with a keffiyeh, then tariffs are evil and autocratic and completely intolerable. This has the predictable result of turning a conversation about a subject of great nuance and complexity and its historical scope into your typical online flame war where 2 opposing camps of low-information morons just scream abusive epithets at one another. But here on this program, we don't play that game. Here on this program, we believe the 30,000-foot historical view is the view that matters most. Why? Because all events in the present day are a culmination of a long series of previous events that transpired in years and decades and centuries past, and current-day arguments that fail to take historical perspective into account are, ultimately, exercises in stupidity and ignorance. So tonight, in the enduring, undying interest of correcting category errors and promoting the public mental hygiene, we present for your kind consideration Curmudgeon's Field Guide to Tariffs. Prologue, the price tag with a flag on it. If you think a tariff is something China pays us for misbehaving, then we need to have a talk. A calm talk, a friendly talk, a talk involving a bit of arithmetic, because somewhere along the way, we as a people developed the charming belief that when Congress places a tariff on imported goods, foreign governments gather in smoky rooms, pass a hat around, and mail us a check with a little note attached to it that says, "Oh, we're sorry about everything," but that is not actually how any of this works. A tariff is not a fine levied against a misbehaving nation. It is not a diplomatic parking ticket. It is not a patriotic surcharge paid by foreigners as some sort of penance. It is, strictly speaking, a tax. Specifically, it is a tax imposed by the United States government on goods entering the United States. If you're wondering who writes the check, the answer is the importer does. The American company that brings the goods through the port. The man standing at the dock, not the man standing in Beijing. The law determines who writes the check, but the market determines who feels the bruise. Now, before anyone starts polishing their pitchforks or fainting into a chaise lounge, let me be clear. Tariffs are not inherently wicked. They are not inherently virtuous. They are tools. Blunt tools. Tools that can raise revenue. Tools that can protect domestic industries. Tools that can distort markets. Tools that can change behavior. But tools nonetheless. And like most other types of tools, they can be prudentially and responsibly used, or they can be used recklessly and destructively, depending on whose hands happen to be holding them at any given moment. And before we argue about whether to swing the hammer, we might want to first start by understanding what a hammer is. Because for roughly about 60% of our national history, tariffs were not some exotic economic side dish. They were the entree. They were how the federal government kept its lights on. For most of American history, the federal government was essentially a customs house with its own navy. There was no income tax, there was no IRS, there was no annual ritual of self-loathing in April each year. There were just ships, ledgers, and dockside receipts. If that surprises you, good. That means we are already learning something. Chapter 1. What a tariff actually is. First, let us define the thing before we weaponize it. I know that's an unfashionable thing to do in a world where nearly all discourse takes the form of an internet flame war, but bear with the host nonetheless. A tariff is a tax imposed on imported goods, not on exporters, not on foreign governments, but on imports. When a shipment of steel or automobiles or washing machines or novelty lawn flamingos arrives at an American port, the importing company pays a tax calculated as a percentage of the value of those goods. That tax becomes part of the cost structure. Now, here is where people start tripping over themselves, typically. Some will say, well, sure, technically the importer pays it, but the foreign producer always absorbs the cost. Well, not always, but sometimes. Others will say, no, the consumer always pays it. Not always, but sometimes. Still others will say, domestic producers always benefit. Again, not always, but sometimes. In other words, welcome to Economic Policy 101, where things are never as simple as your perpetually doom-scrolling brain and your entomological attention span would prefer them to be. Who ultimately bears the cost of a tariff depends on supply chains, on competition, on price sensitivity, and on the relative bargaining power of buyers and sellers. It depends on how easily consumers can switch to alternatives. It depends also on just how desperate foreign producers are to maintain their market access. But one thing it does not depend on is patriotic chanting. The tariff is collected at the border by our government from our importer. That is the starting point. Everything else is market dynamics. And once we understand that, we can start asking better questions. Not does China pay, but what happens next? Chapter 2, Before the IRS, How We Ran the Country on Dock Fees. Now let's rewind the tape for a moment and take a nice long drink of historical circumspection. From 1789 until the early 20th century, tariffs were the primary source of federal revenue, not a side hustle, but the main event. The Constitution itself gave the Congress the power to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises. And in the early republic, duties, meaning tariffs, did most of the heavy lifting. Why was that? Because the federal government was small, really quite small, in fact. There was no sprawling administrative state, there was no Social Security, there was no Medicare, there was no assistant deputy undersecretary in the Department of Alphabet Soup. The federal government built a navy, maintained a few post roads, serviced war debts, and kept the republic stitched together rather loosely, and that was about it. If your government fits inside a shoebox, then dock fees will cover the rent nicely. And this is where things start to get interesting, because tariffs were not merely fiscal instruments, they were political explosives. In 1832, South Carolina decided it didn't much care for a federal tariff law that it considered unfair, so the state legislature passed what was called the Ordinance of Nullification, in which it declared that the tariff was going to be void within its borders. And now you've got a problem, because if a state can simply opt out of federal law, you no longer have a federal government. You have something closer to a suggestion box. Yes, the first shot of the Civil War was fired in South Carolina, but it was not fired at Fort Sumter in 1861. It was fired nearly a full 3 decades earlier when a state declared that it could unilaterally nullify a federal tariff. Before the cannons, before the uniforms, the fight began with a customs schedule. President Andrew Jackson did not find this very charming, but then that was the same reaction he had to most things. He threatened force. Congress duly passed what became known as the Force Bill. You may recall this story from the Insurrection Act episode of 3 weeks ago, because said act was very nearly invoked in this case, but ultimately, the crisis was de-escalated, as sometimes tends to happen when you point bayonets at people and ask them how much they really want to go to federal prison. But the principle was nonetheless established, and there was a principle that said tariffs are not just economic policy, they are constitutional stress tests. They forced the country to confront a question that would not stay buried. Is the Union supreme, or is it optional? That is not a minor footnote. That is a tectonic signature on the civilizational Richter scale. Chapter 3, Protection versus Revenue, Pick a Lane. In the early republic, tariffs were primarily about revenue. Ships come in, goods get taxed, the government gets funded. It's clean, it's simple, it's a nice little balance sheet on a ledger, but as the 19th century progressed, something else crept in. Protection. A revenue tariff is designed to raise money. A protective tariff, on the other hand, is designed to raise prices on foreign goods high enough that domestic producers can compete more easily or indeed dominate outright. And here's the part that almost nobody says out loud. The higher you raise a tariff for protective purposes, the less revenue it may generate, because if you tax imports heavily enough to discourage them, fewer imports arrive. Fewer imports means fewer taxable transactions, which means lower revenue. You can fund a government with tariffs, or you can wall off foreign competition with tariffs, but doing both at maximum intensity is a mathematically awkward proposition. This tension ran through the 19th century like a live wire. Industrial states in the north often favored higher protective tariffs. Agricultural exporting states in the south, which depended on exporting raw materials to foreign markets and on importing finished goods, often despised them. Tariffs weren't just fiscal policy, they were sectional policy. And once again, we find ourselves back at the edge of constitutional argument and political fracture. Because when you use tariffs to rearrange the industrial geography of a nation, you are not just collecting money, you are picking winners. Chapter 4, the 16th Amendment changes the plumbing. And now, inevitably, we arrive at 1913. The 16th Amendment is ratified. Congress is granted clear constitutional authority to levy a federal income tax. Parenthetically, if you ever find yourself getting the impression that many of the worst choices we have ever made as a society happened during the Woodrow Wilson administration, that is not any sort of an accident. And overnight, well, not strictly overnight, but close enough to overnight for our present narrative purposes, the plumbing changes. The federal government is no longer primarily funded by what crosses the docks. It is funded by what crosses your paycheck. And this changes everything. When tariffs were the main revenue source, there was a natural ceiling. You could only tax as much as the ships brought in. You were necessarily constrained by trade volume. But once income taxation becomes central, then constraints shift, and they shift rather wildly. Revenue becomes tied to domestic productivity and earnings, not just to imported goods. This allows the federal government to expand dramatically, exponentially in scope over the course of the 20th century. Foreign wars, social programs, regulatory regimes, all of it required a revenue stream far larger than dock fees could ever hope to sustain. And this is where modern nostalgia sometimes wanders into fantasy. Yes, but we used to run the country without an income tax. Obviously, this is a true statement. We also used to run the country without interstate highways, aircraft carriers the size of small cities, Medicare, or a standing administrative state larger than the national population was on the day the Constitution was ratified. You can fund a minimalist republic on tariffs. You cannot fund a $4 trillion federal apparatus on cargo ships without consequences. Scale matters, and arithmetic remains undefeated. Chapter 5. National security is not a coupon code. Now let's fast forward to the modern era. Tariffs reemerge not primarily as revenue engines, but as strategic tools. Congress has, over time, delegated significant authority to the executive branch to impose tariffs under certain conditions, including national security. And this is where rhetoric becomes elastic. Because who's doing the interpreting, the term national security can mean any number of things. It can mean critical defense materials, supply chain resilience, strategic industries, or occasionally, this industry is politically sensitive. The Constitution grants Congress the power to regulate commerce with foreign nations, but modern statutory frameworks allow presidents to act with considerable discretion and latitude, which means tariffs are not just economic levers. They are separation of powers levers. And whenever executive authority expands in the realm of trade, you're not just arguing about steel or semiconductors. You're arguing about constitutional architecture again. And this argument is not a new one. It is just a new chapter in a much more venerable argument about how power flows in a federal system. Chapter 6. The Georgia-Built Revelation. Now let's address the thing that almost everyone misses in this discussion. The purpose of a tariff is not always to collect money, and it is not always to permanently block imports. Oftentimes, the desired outcome is behavioral change. Imagine that you're a foreign automaker. The United States imposes a not insignificant tariff on imported vehicles. You have the following options: absorb the cost and reduce your profit margin, raise prices and risk losing market share, or move production inside the tariff wall. Option 3 is frequently the entire point. If you want to sell into the American market without paying the tariff, well, you can build your factory here. You can hire American workers. You can source your components domestically. You can produce inside the boundary. And suddenly the tariff disappears because the product is no longer an import. The goal was not punishment. The goal was relocation. That is why your brand new Japanese car might have been assembled in Georgia. It's why foreign steel companies invest in American mills. The tariff is, in part, a sign on the door that reads, if you want to sell here, maybe you might consider living here. Now, does that gambit always work? No, of course it doesn't. Does it always produce efficient outcomes? Again, no, it doesn't. But when it works as intended, it doesn't reduce trade to zero. It changes where trade happens. That is a far subtler distinction than most cable news panels and hyperventilating podcast bros have time for. Chapter 7, Smoot-Hawley, or How to Start a Trade War Without Firing a Shot. Now, no discussion of tariffs escapes the gravitational pull of 1930. The Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act raised U.S. tariffs on thousands of imported goods during the early stages of the Great Depression. And in popular memory, it has become the economic equivalent of lighting a cigarette at a gasoline refinery. The simplified story goes something like this. Congress raised tariffs, other countries retaliated, global trade collapsed, the Great Depression got worse. There is, to be sure, a kernel of truth in that argument. Other nations did respond with retaliatory tariffs. International trade did contract sharply in the early 1930s, but let's resist the temptation to reduce history to a cartoon. The Depression was already well underway before Smoot-Hawley ever passed. Banking failures, monetary contraction, and structural weaknesses were already doing considerable damage. Smoot-Hawley did not single-handedly cause the Great Depression. What it did do was pour sand into an already seizing gearbox. When global demand is collapsing and you raise barriers to trade, that doesn't create resilience, it creates rigidity. And when everyone retaliates at once, that doesn't have the effect of protecting domestic industry, it just shrinks the pie. This is the cautionary tale. Not that tariffs are evil, but rather tariffs deployed into a collapsing global economy can amplify contraction. Tools, context, timing. Swinging a hammer during an earthquake does indeed have consequences. Chapter 8, the thing everyone pretends won't happen. Tariffs are unilateral. Trade is not. If the United States raises tariffs on another country's exports, that country has political incentives of its own. Domestic producers over there demand protection. Politicians respond. Retaliatory tariffs are not exotic, they are predictable. And retaliation does not have to match product for product. If we tariff steel, another country might tariff soybeans. Now, you're not just arguing about industrial policy, you are reshuffling pain across regions and across industries. One sector gains insulation, while another sector gains ulcers. This is why trade policy is never just about economics, it is about coalition management. Every tariff creates beneficiaries, losers, and a lobbying cycle that never ends. Once imposed, tariffs develop constituencies. Industries that benefit from the protection rarely volunteer for exposure afterward, which means tariffs can be politically sticky even when their original justification has faded. And here is the uncomfortable truth. Trade wars are rarely declared. Rather, they are products of accretion. A measure, then a response, then a countermeasure. Until suddenly, everyone is holding fewer customers and issuing more press releases. Chapter 9. Could tariffs replace the income tax? Spoiler alert, no. This is the part where nostalgia takes a deep breath and then leaps off the bridge. Once again, it is tempting to say, well, yeah, but we funded the federal government with tariffs for most of our history. Why can't we just do that again? It is a question with a one-word answer. Scale. The modern federal government spends trillions of dollars annually. To replace the federal income tax entirely with tariffs, you would need to either astronomically raise tariff rates or massively increase import volume, or you would need to reduce the federal government to 19th century proportions, which wouldn't be a bad thing, don't get the host wrong, but option 3 would require a political revolution. Options 1 and 2 collide with arithmetic and behavior. Raise tariff rates high enough to replace income tax revenue, and you drastically reduce import volume, which then shrinks the taxable base. If tariffs successfully suppress imports, then revenue falls. If imports remain high enough to fund the government, domestic producers face continued foreign competition, undermining the protective goal, and the math refuses to cooperate because it just doesn't math. Remember the earlier tension. Revenue tariffs and protective tariffs tend to pull in different directions. You can fund a small republic on dock fees alone. You cannot fund a modern welfare regulatory national security superstructure just by levying tariffs on container ships alone, without either crushing consumer prices or crushing trade volume, or doing both. This is not an ideological sentiment. It is a spreadsheet. And spreadsheets, unlike politicians, do not clap or applause lines. The fact of the matter is, today's U.S. central government has more employees than the population of Panama. In 1789, 1 of every 13,000 Americans worked for the federal government. Today, 1 of 85 Americans does. Would it be great if there was a convenient way to pull down that whole rotten edifice and return the central government to being something more modest and more reasonable? Yes, that would be great. But we are here to deal with objective reality, not to eat pie in the sky. Chapter 10. Tariffs are tools, not theology. At this point, the camps are usually dug in and fully entrenched. On the one side, you have the people saying tariffs are patriotic, they defend the homeland. On the other, you've got the people saying tariffs are ignorant, they sabotage prosperity. Both of these positions suffer from the same disease, and it is the disease of absolutism. A tariff is not a moral statement, it is not a loyalty oath, it is not an act of xenophobia, nor is it an act of enlightenment. It is just a policy instrument. Like any instrument, it can be used strategically, used clumsily, used temporarily, used permanently, used as leverage, or used as political theater. Sometimes tariffs successfully nurture emerging industries. Sometimes they entrench inefficient ones. Sometimes they encourage foreign producers to relocate inside of the tariff wall. Sometimes they invite retaliation that harms exporters. Sometimes they raise revenue efficiently. Sometimes they quietly become a consumption tax borne by domestic buyers. The question is never, are tariffs good? The question is, what problem are we trying to solve, and is this the right tool for solving it? If you treat tariffs as sacred doctrine, you stop measuring outcomes. If you treat tariffs as forbidden heresy, you stop examining context. Either way, you've replaced economics with catechism, and policy is a poor place for religion. Epilogue: the Customs House and the Constitution. Tariffs have financed the federal government. They have nearly fractured the union. They have protected industries, and they have provoked retaliation. They have reshaped supply chains. They have been wielded by Congress. They have been delegated to presidents. They have funded a minimalist republic and been sidelined by a modern superstate. And through it all, they have remained what they always were: taxes at the border. Not magic, not treason, not salvation, and not doom. Just a lever. A lever that moves capital. A lever that moves prices. A lever that sometimes moves politics more than markets. If you want fewer tariffs, argue from math. If you want more tariffs, argue from incentives. But if you argue as though they are mystical forces that either punish foreigners or guarantee prosperity, you are not doing economics. You are doing mythology. And mythology, for all of its charms, does not balance a budget. And with that, we now close the book on this week's field guide. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, ever so much for your kind attention. Please see your nearest serving wench for assistance in settling your tavern tab. And I now convey you into the loving custody of my distinguished colleague, your illustrious co-host, the one and only, your friend and mine, Mr. Caucasian Sasquatch.